Hello, and welcome to the Total Mental Performance Podcast, the one and only mindset podcast dedicated to helping fitness entrepreneurs and coaches master their mindset, giving you insider access to industry leaders around their psychology, their campfire stories, and the mindset required to be successful in this business. I'm your host, Kieran O'Neill, mental performance coach and founder of Total Mental Performance, the world's fastest growing specialist mindset service dedicated to the fitness industry. So, without further ado, let's lean in and listen. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Total Mental Performance Podcast. Today we have Ollie Carson, who's got such an interesting story, ex-military, personal trainer, online coach, and now he's a fitness business mentor. And I'm really excited to him. I've spoken to Ollie before, haven't actually asked him his story yet, so I've been really excited to unpack this live with you guys. Ollie, thank you so much for coming on, mate.
Mate, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it. Like I said, I'm not sure how much we'll get out in the sort of 30-minute allotted slot, but we'll do our best to dig through.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we can always have a follow-up episode for sure. And I'd love to know, how did you get into coaching?
Coaching for me kind of started in the military, to be honest with you. So one of my kind of sub roles in the British Army was a physical training instructor. So specifically working with pre-parachute selection, so helping recruits build physical capability to then go on and pass P Company, which is the British Army's um, parachute course. And that's kind of where I fell in love with coaching and the process of bringing people on and making people fitter and stronger. And I just had a natural tendency to get the most out of people. And so for me, when it was time to leave the military, it was the kind of next natural progression was personal training and taking that skill set into civilian life. So that's kind of where coaching started for me, probably maybe as much as 12 years ago now. So I feel like an old boy.
Mm. And the paratroopers are obviously that is almost, if we was going to think Spartans, we're bringing the
Oh,
Spartans in. That's what the paratroopers are. They're just absolute machines. A good friend of mine, Cameron Clark, I used to box with him. He's a parachuter. He's now actually on the Red Devils team, sort of doing all the show
amazing.
jumping and
Yeah.
all of that. But he was
I,
telling me about his initiation.
oh man, so I'm glad that you've had some stories because I was going to say your mate Cameron is probably a bit of a reprobate if I know anything about Paris.
That's one word. Yeah, we used to call him Tin Man when he used to fight because it was like he had no soul. You could hit him with anything and he'd just eat it and go on then, and he'd throw another one back at you. He was relentless. He was rough and tough and resilient. And I think something about Paras is they're all a little bit crazy in a certain way, in a good way, in a way
Yeah.
that you need to be that sort of Spartan-like character. So that must have been a fascinating journey going through the training and obviously then coaching those individuals.
Yeah, it's unreal, dude. It's unreal to see the progression of somebody coming through the doors with heaps of aspiration and already trying to separate themselves from just kind of regular military tasks, so to speak, and do something that's maybe a little bit more um, difficult and challenging. And seeing that person evolve both physically and mentally throughout the process is really cool. So yeah, very honored to have been given the privilege to take part in that coaching team for a short stint of time. Um, and yeah, definitely served me well in my civilian career as a coach as well.
Run me through some of the lessons that you took from working in that environment, because it's a high performance and gritty environment. So that's going to shape the way in which you coach, the way in which you lead your team, your organization. So what are some of the lessons that we could learn from, would you say?
Well, actually, it was probably lessons that I learned that I couldn't carry over more than anything, just simply because, and some mistakes I made early on in my civilian coaching career was treating my civilian coaching clients as though they were para recruits
Mm.
or just blokes in the regiment getting fit. So I learned a lot about empathy and the difference of what I was doing in the military and what I should be doing in civilian life. And I learned a lot about delivery of coaching. So coaching is as much, in my opinion, about the way that we communicate with our clients and the way that we get them to have those aha moments and breakthroughs, as it is the kind of nuances and the practicalities and the science and so on. But I communication skills was a huge um, asset that I gained from my time in the military that crossed over quite nicely to my civilian career. Um, but yeah, massive lessons were you can't treat everyone like para recruits. It doesn't work in in civilian street. It just
Mm.
doesn't work. But
Yeah.
yeah, there was no huge kind of revelations from that period of time, but more so just that if you want to get the most out of somebody, then your ability to communicate with them is paramount.
And I think it's really tough as human beings because language is the best we've got. It's such a shit way of communicating.
Mm,
And then we have not only spoken word, now we have written language. So much is done via WhatsApp, whether that's texts and voice notes and whatever. And if we're not careful as coaches, we can say something or we can ask a question and it might not be perceived in the right way. And that one little miscommunication can completely blow up a relationship. And as we know, the biggest predictor of success between a coach and a client, they did these studies in therapy where they tried to figure out which was the best type of therapy. Was it CBT? Was it psychotherapy? Was it hypnosis? Was it, all the different types? And they basically figured out the biggest predictor of success across all domains wasn't which type of therapy, it was the relationship between the therapist and the client. It's
mm,
exactly the same as coaches.
mm.
Like if you can't communicate and you can't build those relationships and have that connection, it's going to be much harder for you to get a result. And in a high performance environment like, the paratroopers, you've got to communicate. You've got to, you're the guys that we call when shit hits the fan and it's like, right, we need backup, we need to sort this out.
Yes, 100%. And just touching and elaborating on that point that you made there about communication and how a message is potentially received. It's why I'm so reluctant to send, the written word to clients, in particular if I'm trying to screw their head back on or rein them in or whatever it might be, because as you alluded to, tonality is so important when trying to get your message across. And if it's misconstrued or taken in the wrong way, you can really tarnish that relationship with the client. So for me, as a bare minimum voice note, but ideally a face-to-face conversation like we're having now is often best so that they can see your facial expressions, the energy that you have. I think that's really important.
Something I started doing is sending actual little videos to clients.
Mm,
So if I can't send a voice note and I'm out and about, sometimes I just take a little quick selfie video. I'll be like, "Hey man, talk to me. What's going on?" And I can just sense the energy that you're coming at things. The example I always use is the difference between um, "fuck you" and "fuck you." When it's written in text, all you get is "fuck you," and that's it. When you hear a voice note, you're like, "Oh, okay, I see he's taking the piss."
yes,
Whereas somebody sends you a "fuck you" out of nowhere, and that's an extreme example, right? But you get
yes.
one of those, you're thinking, "What's your problem, dude?" And yeah, it's such an important part
Mm,
of being a coach and also leading a coaching organization.
mm,
Um, I'm interested, mate. There's going to have been such a huge identity shift, shifting out of the military
mm,
into civilian life. I see there's a lot of athletes, a lot of coaches come from an athletic background, and they have to come to. Some of them have to come to terms with maybe I'm not going to make it as a football player or a rugby player or a tennis
mm.
player, and they have to re-shift their identity. And 12
Sure.
years in a high-performance military environment and going into a civilian environment, not only is there the identity shift, but it's so different on so many different levels. The way in which you interact and perceive society in
Yeah.
that environment versus being a soldier is
Mm.
completely different. So I'll be keen to know, what did that process look like for you?
Well, interestingly, most of the identity shifts for me came from my civilian life prior to joining the military, then into the military, and actually my transition out of the army back into civilian life was perhaps a little bit more seamless, just simply because I was quite fortunate in that I was immersed into the coaching role. I started my personal training business straight out the gates, had some relative success early on, and so one of the big things that I know a lot of my ex squaddy friends struggle with is that loss of identity, you know, the purposeful meaning of putting on uniform and doing good, honest work, the pride that comes with putting on, in particular, like a maroon beret if you're in the paras, um, and then losing that identity, so to speak. That can be the most challenging part of the transition back into civilian life. But where I'd started my coaching business and I was doing relatively well, I think that process was rather frictionless for me. But if I'm honest with you, the transition into the military was the biggest change that I made, and I'm kind of happy to talk on that if you'd like. But there's not really much to report leaving the military,
Mm.
going to the civilian life, to be honest with you.
Well, let's go there because a lot of coaches, particularly new coaches, they've been coaching or dealing with human beings for 1 or 2 years.
Mm,
They have to go through a huge identity shift themselves. And
yes.
then as coaches become more established and they start to scale and they start hiring a team, there's another identity shift there away from just hustlepreneur solo coach to business owner and leader and entrepreneur. And
Mm.
so I think there's definitely going to be some lessons in there, and I'm keen to hear.
Yeah, for sure. So, kind of coming from very humble beginnings and having a lot of, I guess, trauma in my early life, the kind of move into military, which came really out of a form of necessity, and that's a story in its own. But the kind of mindset shifts that I needed to make in terms of my sense of self-worth, my ability, my own ability in myself, both physically and mentally, was huge because I never had family or anything who were military or ex-military, so I had no concept of what it was all about. It was completely new to me, and I was just kind of immersed into this all-encompassing environment, which the military really is. It takes over your whole entire life. You've got a new family, you live in new places, you have completely new routines. So it was very, very daunting for me to make that transition from being a bit of a low life myself, growing up in northwest London, getting involved with things that I potentially shouldn't have been involved with. Suffering with mental health issues, with sexual abuse as a younger lad. Um, there were lots of changes that I had to make psychologically to adopt the new kind of persona that I was taking on, this kind of rough and tough military guy. So that was, like I say, that was the biggest shift for me. And actually, those shifts are what ultimately kind of see me here today. I'm 100% certain of that. The military definitely made me into the person that I am now, and I'm incredibly grateful for the time that I served. A lot of people are often quite resentful for the time that they spent in the army because it is quite tough. But for me, it's completely changed my life, and I recommend anyone who is, and I know your podcast listeners are probably coaches and that kind of ilk, and so maybe not in this situation, but if you are somebody who is feeling a little bit aimless or hopeless, the military can do you wonders. It's an incredible place to be.
So a lot of parallels in the military and boxing, like local boxing clubs.
Mm,
It's that story of overactive, and you see this particularly with young men, overactive young men, racing minds. They have a lot of testosterone, a lot of adrenaline, but they don't know how to channel it. And unless you, this is my favorite quote ever from. I'm going to butcher it. It won't be right, but Mike Tyson's coach was Custamato, and I was listening to an audiobook he'd done about delivering a Titanic right hand, and the example he used was about where you put fire and power and energy. And he used to call them, I think it was missile launch systems or power launch systems. So if you look at explosive, you put that into a container. If you look at, say, I don't know, an RPG, right? You've got a lot of explosive. It fires out the back, but it's contained, and then it shoots out. If you look at a bullet, it's got a little explosive and it's contained, and out it goes. And it's exactly the same with throwing a right hand. And I think with young men, when unless they have that structure and other men to guide them through that, I do
mm,
think there's a lot of parallels there between that boxing,
yeah.
that military background, and it can really, really iron some people out. Um, go as deep as you want, insofar as some of those experiences would have been showing up in certain behaviors.
Yes.
So share whichever experiences you feel comfortable sharing, and how did they show up? Because for some other coaches, they will be showing up, but they don't necessarily know why, and they can't really make those connections. And what I found is when we share our stories, people go, well, that's not me, but I feel kind of similar, and I can kind of see that because I had this
Yeah.
happen to me when I was younger. So go
Yes.
think about that point where you decide, because it was a decision, right? You made a
Yeah.
decision. I don't want to continue being the human being I am right now. I don't know how I'm going to evolve out, but I'm going to find a way. So, if you could pick one or two formative experiences
Mm,
that led to you to that point where you made the decision to shift your identity,
mm,
and what the warning signs were, I appreciate
mm.
that's a lot, but that would be awesome.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the first point to note is that I only have this level of self-awareness through therapy myself. So I've had a lot of CBT myself, hypnotherapy for for post traumatic stress disorder and things of that nature, and depression at several points in my life as well. Um, to give some context, I suffered with PTSD many years after leaving the military. So a lot of guys will suffer either during or immediately leaving. I had some traumatic experiences on a tour in Afghan, a couple of situations that didn't really cause any issues at the time, or even immediately afterwards, or even 1 or 2 years down the line. But actually, I was living in a barn, sorry, on a farm with just two other residents on the kind of plot. And to cut a long story short, I was living next to a guy who owned a gym facility, an older guy. His name was Chris, and just by chance, I online coached. So this is when I was a civilian. I've left the military at this point. I've been out for a few years. I online coached his receptionist at his gym facility, and she just happened to message me and say, "I know you live next door to Chris. Could you go in and check on him? We haven't seen him for a couple of days, and we're worried about him." So I went around to his house. Door was ajar. Something was, afoot. You could tell straight away it just wasn't right. Heating was on full blast. This was in the middle of the summer. Um, so I basically went in and was calling his name, no response. I started searching his house and basically found him in his bedroom with a shotgun on his chest, with his head all over the wall.
Yeah.
To put it bluntly. And that for me was the catalyst to bring up some of those issues that I'd experienced in Afghan, and kind of triggered what I would deem as PTSD, which is when I started getting CBT and hypnotherapy and things of that nature to kind of help me work through some of the things that were troubling me. And so I can only look on my actions and the way that I've behaved over the years, retrospectively, very self-aware as I am now, because I've been through that experience, and because I've had the CBT, which has given me the insight as to why I was behaving the way that I was. But one of the things that I've noticed is that um, I very much have this burning desire to be, and it's definitely ego, but this masculine, dominant alpha male type persona. And I think that really does stem back, as I kind of just touched on very briefly a minute ago, with sexual abuse as a younger man. I think I was about 10 or 11 years old. It kind of stripped me of a sense of self-worth. It stripped me of a sense of masculinity. I struggled with that a lot as I was growing up. And I can only speak freely about it, or I've only been able to speak freely about it in the last sort of 2 or 3 years as I've become more and more mature. But yeah, definitely that feeling of not being good enough, not being a man, has definitely led me to make decisions down the line in my life that are ultimately just my ego saying, this will make you more manly. Go and jump out of aircraft. Go and be an elite soldier. Go and do this. Start your own business or whatever. And it's not necessarily to say that those are a bad thing, but I definitely think that my actions are a direct result of what's happened in my past experiences. So yeah, that's been interesting to kind of reflect on and kind of work out why I've been doing what I've been doing over the last few years.
You know, that's so powerful. And what's really beautiful about that is I think you've truly conquered something when you can talk about it.
Mm,
When you can't talk about it, it's still holding power over you.
yes.
When you can't talk about it, it's still there.
Mm,
And the fact that you're able to reflect and understand where does that come from, that drive to dominate, that drive to be the alpha male and grow, it's a wonderful thing. And having that self-awareness and that strength to work through it makes a huge difference, particularly with male sexual abuse, because societally that's a female problem.
mm,
So there's an extra added level of shame around
yes.
that you have to unpack. And
Yeah.
kids go one or two ways. They go, yeah, you're right, I'm not good enough, and they give up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you see, people really hitting the bottom and then just never bouncing back up. Or they go, well, fuck you, I'm going to prove you wrong. And that's where we see these driven individuals
Mm,
go out and achieve something. And as you know, it'll take you to a certain level, but eventually you hit that glass ceiling of, that's not serving me anymore. I call it um, the underdog cycle. So when you're the perceived underdog, or you're not the alpha male, you work really, 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 really hard to get there. So as you're working, you have this sense of meaning, this sense of purpose, and you're grafting. I call that the meaning and graft phase.
Right.
Then what happens is you hit a certain level, and then you're like, well, now what? Because I've sort of achieved success here. Uh, or what do I do? And then you start to get bored, you start to experience doubt, you start questioning yourself, you start questioning everything, or you take your foot off the gas and you relax for everything you've worked so hard for. And then sabotage or external crisis comes in, so you're the perceived underdog again, and you get stuck in those cycles. And what causes us to be the underdog? It's those formative experiences, not feeling enough, not feeling worthy, as a kid, that then causes us that. But you probably experienced this as well. In my personal coaching, there was a moment that was really clear, which was, how can I be the king of the kingdom if I'm still the underdog? And when that happened and I made that psychological shift, it was like, fuck. So you can see all of those formative experiences that lead to that need to dominate. And I think instantly when we spoke, we could connect, because
Mm.
I felt similar from not being good enough as a kid, then
Mhm.
to having to be the guy that punches everyone in the face, and then a software sales guy that makes loads of money. Because if
Yeah.
a real man can beat the shit out of people and make loads of money, right? There's
Yeah.
air quotes going up for
Yeah.
everyone that's listening on the podcast. You know, so I can really, really resonate with that. But that's what's allowed you to achieve the success, not just once, but multiple times in your career, and that's what's led you there today.
Oh, and dude, it's really important to note at this point as well that it's a blessing and a curse, because, from one perspective, you can look at it and say it's ultimately been the driving force in my life. But it's come with its downsides. I've had two divorces. I've just gone through a separation most recently with my children's mother. Um, and a lot of that boils down to my very extreme personality. I'm a very all or nothing type of person. I'm constantly doing new things. I'm constantly trying to challenge myself, be it physically, in business, in my personal life, whatever. And that is quite difficult for people to manage and live with. So it does have its downsides. And as you alluded to, I think it's all about a game of perspective. I love the story of the two sons, the sons to the alcoholic father. And it's like the dad was an absolute reprobate. He was a bit of a thief. He was an alcoholic. One son grows up to be this incredibly successful guy who's got a great family. The other son grows up to be just like his dad. And when asked the same question, why are you the way that you are? They both said the same thing. Well, my dad's like that. How could I not be? And it's just kind of like this game of perspective. So, if somebody's listening to this and they feel as though their past experiences has maybe shaped them in such a way that is good or bad or indifferent, I think if you can flip your perspective, then you can make it a superpower as opposed to a crutch, which is what I've thankfully managed to do.
Yeah, there's such a beauty in that. So I have ADHD, and there's some real upsides to that,
Mm.
like drive and focus and creativity and hyper focus, whatever. But there's some downsides, and I coach a lot of coaches that have ADHD, and it links into this point which you said, which is, it's a superpower, but it's also a curse. What I call it is, it's a superpower, but there's also kryptonite, and
Mm.
each little bow or each little sword, double-edged sword that I have, yeah, I'm really hyper focused on the things I'm interested in. Give me something I'm not interested in, and it crumbles. I can't do it, and it's a nightmare. So we all have these different strengths and weaknesses and these
Mm.
superpowers, but we all have these kryptonites. I think the key is being really self-aware, doing that deeper work, understanding where all of that comes from,
Mm.
and then building systems and structure in your team around that, so you can minimize the downside and maximize the upside.
100%.
I have a question. Think back to that young you at that 11, 12-year-old that
Mm.
set the path, that made that decision. Well, fuck you. I'm going to prove you all wrong, and went down the decisions he made. What are you proud of him for?
Not a huge amount because from 11 to sort of 18, 19, when I did join the military, I probably went on the wrong path. I became a bit of a tearaway, got involved in crime, and I was doing a lot of things that I shouldn't have been doing. And joining the military more came out of a sense of I needed to do it because I was heading in a really bad direction. But I am proud of the fact that in that one pivotal moment, and it was a pivotal moment, I made the decision to go the hard route, which was to, go through the upheaval of joining the military, leaving the family home, leaving all of my friends behind, um, putting myself in an environment where I had to take orders from people, which is something that I wasn't ever good at doing. Um, but I knew that ultimately taking the hard route was better long term for me. So that's the one thing that I'm proud of myself for was taking the hard option. And something that I've learned subsequently is that quite often taking the harder course of action is often the best for you. We as humans like to take the path of least resistance. Um, but there are some many great, wonderful things to be had by treading the path less trodden. So very, very glad that I took that decision at that age and joined the military. It changed my life for good.
If you do what is hard, life will be easy. If you do what is easy, life will be hard. And
Yes.
there's a big decision to be made there. James Caan, the the recruitment entrepreneur, and he was on Dragon's Den. I read his book when I was a kid, and there's one thing in it that stuck with me forever, which is when everybody goes right, go left. When the
Yes.
masses go that way, go this way, go the other way. Have a look. There's probably a different perspective that you're not spotting. And
Yes.
in your environment, it would have been easy to have stayed there. It would have been easy to have stayed at home. It would have been easy to have, stayed where you were with your friends and doing the same things. Fucking hell, what's scarier than going to the most difficult regiment in the whole of the fucking army, away from everyone, away from your friends, away from your family, and then eventually finding yourself out, in the Middle East. That's low, but that is what shaped you to where you got to today, and the impact that you're having, which is incredible. Think back to that 11 and 12-year-old. If you could pass on any knowledge, any wisdom that you had now, what would you pass on?
That more often than not, it will be all right. I think that's one of the things that's held me back in the past is, you know, this kind of innate fear of failure or this fear of, taking risk or whatever. More often than not, it's going to be fine. And I'm sure, much like me, you've been at points in your life where it feels like your whole world is crumbling down. I've had that in 2 divorces, and like I say, I've been worse than broke. In huge amounts of debt, and it's always going to be fine. And maybe that's a little bit, um, maybe that's a little bit airy fairy for me to say, and it's not always the case, of course. But I mean, I always just say to myself, what's the worst case scenario here? What is the potential worst outcome? And that's often enough for me to make a bold decision. So yeah, to my 11-year-old self, I would just say that it's going to be all right, you know. And I'm proud of myself for now, and again, only in the last few years, but being able to speak about my experience. And I think that's one of the problems, especially as males, we don't speak about those sorts of things enough. But if we did, we would quickly realize that it's way more common than it should be. But in that, there is some security that you're not alone. Um, it does happen, unfortunately, but it doesn't make you any different. It's nothing to be ashamed of, and it shouldn't strip you of a sense of masculinity or pride or whatever. That's just your ego. So yeah, I'm proud of myself for that.
Yeah, dude, it's very powerful. It's incredibly powerful, and I agree. See, I think we can learn a lot from women, and their ability to open up and share and grow. There's a hell of a lot in that. For some reason, we
Yes.
tend to just completely shut down, and I think you were probably like me, which was you going to therapy when therapy wasn't cool and mental health wasn't cool, and you wouldn't really speak about that stuff, and it's almost be ashamed
Yes.
to go there and reach out, but we're getting there, we're moving forward, and I do think the stigma is changing. And for those that don't necessarily have those traumatic backgrounds and those experiences, it can only take one moment that can stop you from being a top performer.
Mm.
It can be one moment where you didn't feel good enough, you didn't feel worthy, whatever it was. And if you can shift those moments and reframe those moments from a performance outcome, whether that's personally, whether that's revenue, whether that's clients, whether that's coaching, it can absolutely change the game. And I'm sure you've seen that with yourself. Because it's funny how personal moments play into our professional and entrepreneurial moments, isn't it?
Mm, massively. I honestly look at my entire upbringing and the experiences, traumatic or otherwise, as a huge superpower for me, because they've given me this sense of context. And when it comes to making difficult decisions or taking the difficult route, I've got this wonderful context of actually that's difficult, that's very difficult, that was very traumatic or hard, and so this is going to be easy. And so actually, if you can reframe those challenging times in your lives and use them as a bit of a as a blessing in some way, then use it as something that serves you as opposed to drains you. And I know that's quite often easier said than done. Um, but again, the game of perspective is a beautiful game to play.
That's it. And we can look at that as sort of a bigger, wider philosophical, personal ascension perspective. But some people don't think like that. And some people that are listening to this podcast will be thinking, show me the fucking money. So here's where the money is, mate. This is how you're going to get some more leads. That is your unique story that no one else can take away from you.
Mm.
And your clients work with you for a reason. And the more that you can understand yourself, the more you can understand your stories, why you tick, why you operate, you'll be much better at serving your clients. Because once you understand yourselves, you understand your clients, because your clients work with you because they see something in you, or they believe that you have something they don't have yet. So if I want to get commercial about it, by doing the work and understanding that stuff and forget all the personal growth and change, the amount of learnings and the amount of content that you can pull out.
Yes.
Me being able to share stories from when I was a kid and just like you, I'm guessing the connections you have with your coaching clients, it's so much easier than when you're just reading out of a coaching book and do these press ups or do this workout plan, do this nutrition plan. That everybody's got that, but nobody can take away your formative experiences.
And like, what better way to connect and build relationships with your clients or your prospective clients than having much deeper personal situations and scenarios that you share, and if you can resonate with somebody on that level, then that's a client for life. So like you say, dude, if you want to flip this into something that's going to make you money, which a lot of your listeners probably will, then use it for that. Use it to build unbelievable relationships with your clients and your prospective clients, because there's people out there who will resonate with you on a far deeper level if you're able to be open about those things.
That's exactly it. I've got one final question, mate. Forget us as an organization, as a team, or as coaches, but what does the phrase total mental performance mean to you? If you had it, how would you know?
The phrase total mental performance for me would be, it's like optimizing your ability to channel your mental strength. So it's like, what can we be doing? What can we be working on up here? And for anybody who's not watching, I'm pointing to my head. What can we be optimizing up there that translates into our physical actions? So whether that's the way that we speak to ourselves, what we do with our structures, our routines, all of the things that come out in physicality, how do we optimize that? And for me, that's what total mental performance is. It's working on the thing that's most important, which is the thing between your ears.
The 6 inches between your ears. Love it. Mate, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor having you on. Thank you so much for opening up and sharing, and we'll definitely get a follow-up episode at some point in the future. Where can everyone find you?
Easiest place to find me would be my Instagram account, which is Ollie, Ollie Carson, Carson, and then there's 2 underscores there, unfortunately. Yeah, that's all of my links, etc. in there.
Awesome. Guys, send Ollie some love if you listen to this. Tag us in your stories. Let us know some feedback. Always leave us a rating, as always, on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. This is the Total Men's Performance Podcast. Mate, thank you so much for coming on. Had an absolute blast, and hopefully you did too.
Thank you so much for having me, dude. Appreciate it.